Good day and welcome to the CDI Talks. My name is Anton Shekhovtsov and I'm the director of the Austria-based NGO Center for Democratic Integrity that analyzes attempts of authoritarian regimes to influence politics in Europe. My guest today is Velina Tchakarova, the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. She also conducts strategic foresight and trends analysis for the Austrian Defense Ministry. Velina Tchakarova currently writes a book on the Dragonbear. She coined this term to refer to China and Russia, so she writes a book on the Dragonbear impact on global affairs based on systems thinking, strategic foresight, geopolitics and geoeconomics. Do like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel to get notified on the future episodes of the CDI Talks. Velina, thank you very much for this conversation. Let me ask you first. You coined the term Dragonbear in 2015, so several years ago. Now it's being used, as you mentioned, by other scholars, by other experts. My question would be, what are the reasons for combining China and Russia under one conceptual roof of the Dragonbear?
Thank you for the invitation, first and foremost. Second, I coined the term the Dragonbear in 2015 to point to a game changer in international relations. One that basically is now taking more shape in 2021. And in a sense, I pointed to a unique mode of navigating through the global system transformation. I don't look at the Dragonbear, that means relations between China and Russia, as being based on a strategic alliance, nor as an axis of convenience or a marriage of convenience, but as a mode of systemic coordination in various key domains and sectors, reaching from trade, energy, to space technologies. That means also navigating the fourth industrial revolution, which is now taking place, to military and defense sector, and of course with all the deviations that are also being entailed. And in a sense, it has been one of the most overlooked geopolitical phenomena of the last decade by the West, either neglecting these realities on the ground or underestimating the possible second-order effects of this kind of systemic coordination. But the trend in the bilateral relationship, and also meanwhile the multilateral relationship stemming from the Dragonbear, that means the Dragonbear in relations with third regions or third countries, is absolutely clear. In a sense, it has been growing since 2014-2015 for very obvious reasons. We can touch upon them later in this talk. But the trend now is also basically positive in all these various domains and key sectors that I've named.
But this is also a very Western-centric concept, because I think Australian experts would not refer to the Dragonbear, because for them, the bear, Russia, is not that important as China.
Indeed, which also is part of this kind of huge phenomenon in the current global affairs that I also describe or at least argue that is going towards a bifurcation of the global system, because one of the major anticipations for the last decade by the West, by Western analysts, was and it still remains that we are living in a multipolarity, that this kind of Western-based multilateralism is alive and kicking, and that this actually determines the nature of international relations. Per 2021, I argue that we are actually in the middle of the greatest shift in the international relations since the last 70 years. And that kind of bifurcation of the global system based on the emergence of two, or if you like, re-emergence, because China has been already a global power back in the history. So in a sense, it's a re-emergence of, being global power center. So that kind of situation of having two centers of power creates a lot of centrifugal forces. You gave the example with Australia. Now Australia has been oscillating between the two centers of power, with having a great geoeconomic clout in the relations with China. However, now it has actually taken a clear decision in favor of the Anglosphere alliance of powers that actually seek to do what? To build a counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific region. So in a sense, Russia, as you mentioned, is not there yet. Russia is not in the Indo-Pacific, it's not present there, but that doesn't mean that Russia is not working towards creating opportunities and achieving an access to the Indo-Pacific region. I can give you a few examples. One, of course, is now via the new geopolitical situation in Afghanistan. That means that securing the whole Central Asia suddenly becomes a common geopolitical and security-related task for both China and Russia. From there, you take Afghanistan, you take Iran, you have a huge new connectivity, transport, energy, or trade route, if you like. And from Afghanistan, where actually there is already an existent economic corridor in Pakistan via China, with a port in Gwadar, you have an access to the Indian Ocean. So in a sense, India is now a little bit too squeezed in this particular area, but Russia has been working on a transport connectivity with India before the takeover of the Taliban, which has more than 7,000 kilometer transport corridor connecting India, Iran, and Russia, and from there on, of course, opening an access to the European markets. And in a sense, these kind of projects are going to be now diversified by Chinese rules, of course. But there, I see a huge opportunity for Russia, a new kind of equilibrium, because China cannot do it on its own. And a second example I can give you regarding the Indo-Pacific and why at some point the Dragonbear is going to be an issue in this particular part of the world is that Russia has been trying to actually acquire military presence in several African countries. And if you look at the map, some of them are actually positioned, located in the eastern coasts of Africa, and in a sense starting from Egypt and then moving basically vertically along the eastern coast, with now a failed attempt to get a military base in Sudan. Once the map looks very different, and in a sense Russia is going to pursue this interest of getting a direct access, and from there to create a regional power projection, if you like, in coordination and in cooperation with other partners.
Indeed, we see that in Africa, we see this competition between China and Russia. They are competing for influence, they're competing for resources, I guess, as well. But as you mentioned in several papers of yours on the Dragonbear, this term does not mean that China and Russia, that their interests always coincide. They are different. And going back to Europe, I would like to ask you, against the background of the influence of China and Russia in Europe, what are the differences and similarities between their approaches to this influence in Europe in particular?
Before I answer the question, I want to stress that this is exactly the point of not always with each other, but never against each other kind of an approach, realizing that their interests and goals do not coincide, but creating opportunities whenever possible, as you gave the example with Africa, where both are simultaneously acting, and the same applies for Europe. So both are on the ground for various reasons. Russia, of course, historically a big player on the old continent, a European power, former empire. In a sense, it has always looked at this geography, this geographic area as actually its own direct vicinity, its own geoeconomic and geopolitical space to penetrate whenever it suits its interests and its goals. And this is not going to change. So in a sense, specifically the former Soviet bloc, the Central Eastern European countries are feeling the pressure and the presence by Russia the most. Now, what is interesting is that China has chosen exactly the same corridors for its economic projects, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, but also the 17+1 initiative, meanwhile 16+1 initiative, because Lithuania decided to exit this initiative, pointing to the importance of having actually a 27+1 initiative when it comes to dealing with China. So, of course, the approaches are different in a sense because China is looking for a geo-economic clout first and foremost. So here, the political influence, the full spectrum of hybrid warfare, taking cyber attacks or disinformation campaigns into considerations are not so important for China. And even during the COVID-19, which was a kind of a eye-opener for a lot of European governments, but also societies, when it comes to Chinese influences on the ground, was more or less related to positive image creating campaigns rather than what we are used to see from Russia, which is always trying to destabilize, using various tactics, instruments, agents of influence. So it's really a very comprehensive, long-standing approach that Russia has been always using. It has never ceased to exist. That is very important because right now we are listening a lot. We are hearing a lot about hybrid warfare, but hybrid warfare as part of this whole comprehensive, non-kinetic way of waging wars with competitors and rivals has always been in place during the time of the Soviet Union and afterwards, with Russia being the successor of this kind of tactics. So in a sense, this is something I see as a huge difference. Meanwhile, however, we are also observing that China has managed to create islands of political influence as well. Now, if we take, for instance, Greece or Cyprus into consideration, we see that certain political behavior, for instance, when it comes to voting within the European Union institutions, has clear, so to say, signs of a kind of influence in favor of Chinese interests. So that is a worrisome trend that needs to be tackled, that needs to be addressed, where the two actors have also a common approach. Specifically when it comes to Europe is, of course, when it comes to human rights, value-based international relations, and the rules-based multilateralism, where you see how both actually do not like this kind of European approach, or if you like, even Western kind of approach, and they really tried to undermine it via the tools I mentioned, but also by coordinating positions. So let's take, for instance, the UN Security Council as an example, and you see how both have, as permanent members, have actually coordinated positions when they actually favored certain resolutions when they fitted their interests, and they were voting against mostly US-led resolutions or European-led resolutions. This is going to be problematic in the future. This is going to create more problems. The same applies to other international or regional organizations where the clout of the two is increasing based exactly on this anti-Western, anti-American, and meanwhile also anti-European agenda. And in a sense, the combination of a growing geo-economic clout by China in Europe, and here it's not just Central and Eastern Europe, because China is aiming for the industrial heart of Europe, which is Germany, which is France, which is Italy, which is Spain. And Russia, of course, has sought and will seek also in the future a kind of political, Russia-friendly, let's say, Russia-friendly party actors, Russia-friendly governments, Russia-friendly positions, Russia-friendly policies. And this is not going to change. So the combination of the two might create huge problems for the European leadership.
I have this idea also about the differences in these approaches of China and Russia to the EU. Is not China is actually not very much interested in weakening the EU, while Russia is definitely trying to somehow undermine the unity of the European Union. And China, for example, when it establishes its influence in Central and Eastern Europe, it considers these countries as the entry point to those industrial giants that you mentioned. So, for example, I think it was not in the interests of China to somehow undermine Ukraine's rapprochement with the EU. It would probably like to establish its influence in Ukraine and then have Ukraine being integrated in the EU. So China would have even more access to the European Union. This is not the case for Russia. What do you think about this?
That is absolutely a correct assessment. China sees the Eastern European countries. These are 3 countries that have signed association agreements and deep and comprehensive free trade agreements with the European Union. Basically, that would mean an integration into the common market without participation in the European Union's institutions. That would create huge opportunities for China, how to enter the common market through the weakest spots. In a very similar way, they look at the Western Balkan countries, which are either somewhere in the middle, actually, of their enlargement process. And that has been the case for the last 20 years. And there is no perspective of enlargement for at least until at least 2030, but still another way how China can actually get an access to the common market. And then, of course, the so-called 16+1 initiative countries, these are part of them, but also, of course, established Central European countries, the so-called Visegrad, for instance. This is another way how to do it. Whereas Russia, of course, pursues the goal of undermining the European enlargement, so take the case of Serbia, for instance, you can also take Montenegro into consideration, Bosnia to some extent with the role of Republika Srpska. So wherever possible, wherever there are channels of influence where you can actually create a narrative that the enlargement is a failure, that the European Union is not functioning, this is definitely kind of a part of the Russian portfolio. But in a sense, I see that actually there is a shift in this approach when it comes to China, because the European Union, specifically the Commission, has established a new approach, has actually launched a new approach towards China, which is a threefold approach, basically engaging China as a negotiating partner whenever there are common interests, for instance, climate change, health issues, then considering China as being economic competitor, and finally, systemic rival. And in a sense, this kind of institutional approach is something that neither Russia nor China would actually ever approve or deal with, and will try, of course, to undermine. Now, the current situation is that the so-called comprehensive agreement on investments with China, so basically between the European Union and China, has been put on hold by the European Parliament based on human rights violations and labor rights violations. So in a sense, China is increasingly seeing this kind of approach as problematic for the future relations with the European powers, not to speak of Russia, which has always tried to actually undermine the role of the European Union institutions and deal with all relevant powers in Europe through bilateral channels. So basically engaging each one of them in bilateral manner. And this is something where I think that China is going to increasingly copy paste from the Russian approach in the future, and we should be aware of it.
I cannot agree more here, because China now understands that it's much more difficult to deal with the European as such as the institution, because it can, the European Union, the European Commission, and even in the European Parliament, they can refer to the European values and say, well, we cannot really have a normal partnership with a country that violates particular values that are very important for the European Union. But I'd like to remark that it's quite ironic that in the Western Balkans, those intellectuals, those experts, those officials and politicians who push for the integration into the European Union, they actually have China and a liberal state as an ally in this European integration. Both are interested, both liberals in those countries and China and a liberal state. European countries assess presumed threats coming from China and Russia in a very different way. What explains these differences? Can they be explained only by economic or business interests?
To answer directly the latter, of course not. But in a sense, we are right now here in Europe, we are right now in a process that's called strategic compass, where all 27 governments are trying to identify their new so-called threats and risks. And in a sense, the next step would be to come together, discuss all these various threats and threats perceptions, specifically risks, and based on this kind of risk analysis to come up with hopefully common ground for common European threats and risks. A very complex process that is not open to the society. We really don't have any idea what's being discussed behind the curtains. In a sense, this kind of risks analysis have been conducted by the governments. As I said, at some point there will be definitely an announcement, and there will be published, hopefully, also the outcome of this process. And the expectation is that during the French presidency next year, in the first half of the next year, that there will be a public discussion on that. So currently, we are in a situation where there is no real common denominator for security risks and security threats. In a sense, of course, one might argue terrorism-related activities might be one of these. I mean, if you look at most of the polls in the European Union countries, this is definitely almost always present. The effects from the migration crisis in 2015 are still being felt within the European societies, in a sense that also during the polls, based on the polls, you will see this as being described as one of the risks. But if you look at the so-called European powers, the big players on the old continent, most of the risks that are being put on the top of the lists by the citizens are of non-security, non-defense nature. So climate change is now number one threat according to the German society. And that is quite telling also how governments are shaping narratives or communicating with their citizens when it comes to the true nature of global affairs. Because in my view, nothing has changed in terms of competition between global and regional powers. In reality, the risks and the threats have been actually moving towards Europe in both the southern and the eastern neighborhood. And this kind of ring of crisis has becoming closer and closer, has been coming closer and closer to the European capitals. And in a sense, whether they like it or not, at some point they will have to deal with it in terms also of deciding whether hard power needs to be applied or not. Because other regional actors, such as Russia or Turkey, are already doing this. So in a sense, there is a huge dichotomy when it comes to perceptions from the citizens. We have become a kind of an island of the blessed on this continent, where the citizens have very often no idea what is going on around us in terms of true security risks and real threats. And in a sense, of course, the soft power agenda of the European Union is going to determine a lot what is going to be put on this strategic compass, unless the reality hits, so to say, so hard that a lot of pain is being induced. I don't see any real shift in this kind of debates, discussions, or whatsoever. From the use of hard power, even in the direct vicinity, to topics such as the use of drones or the use of artificial intelligence. All of these are more or less non-topics, no starters for any kind of open public debate in our European member states. And in a sense, my anticipation is that it's going to be once again a long process with very few deliverables.
Do you think that the cancellation of the contract between Australia and France will have some impact on France's position towards China and policies of the EU towards China? Because I think that this realignment, or at least the US decision to say that China is now the biggest competitor, and then Europe has to somehow decide where it is. So what are your thoughts on this?
First, our tactics has been tactics as an institutional actor, the European Union as an institutional actor, together with the member states. The tactics in this emerging systemic rivalry between Washington and Beijing has been to oscillate between the two. So basically being a security partner of the one, but at the very same time engaging China via business ties and economic projects. So in a sense, oscillating by trying to maximize gains and in a sense, this is a tactics. This is not a strategy. This is destined to fail in the long term, in a sense that I argue that all middle powers, and this is exactly the case with Australia, and we are going to see similar cases with other middle powers, which are currently oscillating between the two centers of power, that at some point they will have to take either or decision. They will have to position themselves.
But where does this obligation come from? Is it coming from China?
It's not an obligation. It is actually a shift, which is a game changer, if you like, which is a result of the global system transformation. Because on the one side, the United States as the unilateral center of power, as the only power that actually still possesses global power projection capabilities, is of course in a state of transitioning towards a new geographic pivot, that is the Indo-Pacific region, is in a phase of re-engaging with new alliances and forming new alliances, forging new partnerships, getting rid of some of the old partnerships. And in a sense, where I see the greatest danger is, and this was a wake-up call, the AUKUS was a wake-up call, the very fact that it was announced on the same day as the European Union announced its so-called strategy for the Indo-Pacific means only one thing. Both approaches have not been coordinated. Both alliances or strategies have not been communicated, even with the most important transatlantic ally, which is the United States. So in a sense, this is not an obligation. This is basically a reality that is emerging out of these transformation processes and structures that we are witnessing right now. And that is why the middle powers are currently trying to make the best out of it. So they think that by oscillating, by not taking sides, they might really benefit from the situation. But I argue that might work for the short term, it won't work for the long term. And in a sense, specifically France felt the pain, what it really means in terms of credibility, in terms of trust, but also in terms of, if you like, engaging with long-term partners and allies. And one thing has to be clear, and that is that actually France, as an actor, security and military actor, that is the hard conclusion that Paris needs to draw from this development, that the United States military is to countries in Central and Eastern Europe what it is to Australia in the Indo-Pacific. So long as this is not the case with France, nothing's going to change in the perception in this specific region of Europe when it comes to the special role the United States is playing on the ground, which of course will create further fragmentation within the transatlantic allies when it comes to the future of Europe. And my greatest fear is that based on this fragmentation and dividing lines, there might be the case that Europe turns into somehow geopolitical backyard of the global affairs.
And I think this is, the emergence of this AUKUS, the French are joking about this, saying it is hocus pocus, suddenly emerging. I think it's a great present to Putin's Russia. This lack of communication between the allies, the sudden emergence, the cancellation of the multi-billion contract, this is all, playing into the Kremlin's hands, that now can say, well, look, you are not necessarily dependent on Washington, but you trust Washington. And then you have this mistrust, you have this lack of communication. Why do you ally yourself with Washington? So this could be used by Russia.
Definitely. Creating any anti-American sentiments.
Especially using the French,
yes.
Especially using this
France
traditional...
has been, of course, a very special case within NATO. And when it comes also to pushing towards a European strategic sovereignty or autonomy or whatever kind of, European Union-led strategically oriented projects in terms of industry, in terms of space, in terms of nuclear, in terms of military. So in a sense, this is a huge challenge for France, which is now more or less being left alone following the Brexit to take care of the European projects in security and military terms, because Germany, as we know, has a very different strategic culture and is not going to take a really important, will play a role, of course, without any doubts, but it sees its role more in the geo-economic cloud rather than in the security and defense domain. And this is not going to change with the new government, for sure.
Going back to the development of the strategy of the EU strategy towards China, for example, let's have this hypothesis. For example, the EU comes with a very elaborate and detailed approach towards China. Would it try, in your opinion, to somehow demand from other countries, such as the Western Balkans, that are striving to join the EU, or, for example, the Eastern Partnership countries, would the EU demand from them to take the same approach as the EU takes towards China?
It can demand whatever it wants, but the question is, of course, would they stick to it or not? In a sense, as we know, the European Union institutional approach is, when it comes to the relations with these parts of the old continent, it's based on conditionality. So, in a sense, anything that is actually helping them to come closer to the European Union, might be also related to certain conditionality. Like, let's say, the example of China. I don't think that this is going to be the case, to be honest with you, because even the European Union member states cannot agree on a coherent approach to China. As I said, there are now good steps to move the relationship to an institutional level rather than the bilateral level. This was the case during specifically the German presidency. The timing of the signing of this comprehensive agreement on investment was very misfortunate. Before Biden actually officially stepped into his new role in the United States administration, but in a sense, it was an important approach and it was an important step. As I said, the timing basically was a no-go, but in a sense, having the European Union Commission as playing the role of a bad cop in the relation with China is definitely a must, because most of the member states, and specifically the Eastern European or, for instance, the Western Balkan states, do not have the size, the scope, the capabilities, the leadership to tackle China's rise. They are too small to make any difference. So in a sense, only together they can make a really difference. But here, once again, we observe that the big players have their own stakes and have their own interests. So take Italy into consideration. Now there is a shift because there is a new government, new leadership with Draghi, and suddenly all these friendly policies and meetings between Italy and China shifted towards a more pragmatic, pro-European-like approach. Take Germany into consideration, huge stakes at play, specifically when it comes to Germany's access to the Chinese market in the future. So in a sense, there is once again a dichotomy, because the big players are going to pursue their national interests, whereas the small member states are destined to follow European Union approach, because otherwise they will not have any chance to make a difference or to achieve any kind of success in their future relations with China.
Well, and sometimes there isn't much political will to somehow stand up to China and Russia. For example, take Serbia. The European Union has totally failed to convince Serbia to introduce the same sanctions against Putin's Russia as the EU imposed. And Serbia is trying to sit not only on 2 chairs, but on 3 chairs, the European Union, China, and Russia. So it's not only about the size, but also the political will of the elites inside those countries.
Well, and that is once again the question: are there really 3 chairs? Because the Serbian leadership, led by Vučić and his network, is exactly doing what I've already gave as an example by looking at the role of middle powers. Now, the small ones are doing something similar. I mean, he sees that the two, China and Russia, understand each other very well right now, cooperate in all these fields, and he's exploring these opportunities to navigate and actually take what it can from the relationship with the European Union, which is in a sense also the role of Brussels and the role of the European powers to put more pressure on him and his network, because if you look at all the investments, if you look at all the money of, financing and whatsoever, you will realize that the share of the European Union and member states is huge as compared to the one by Russia or China. So it's once again a dichotomy, because there is a political leverage that he's exploring by engaging with China and Russia. But in a sense, all these disinformation campaigns, for instance, if you look at them, take the billboards into consideration when there is a state visit from China or Russia, the sad reality is that it comes really from the local elites rather than from the external actors. The external actors exploring this situation but they don't even, and exploiting, of course, mostly exploiting, but in a sense they don't have to do much because the whole homework is being done by the elites themselves. So all this kind of disinformation being spread towards their own population, where they at the very same time have no idea where Serbia is in terms of enlargement, in terms of progress in the reforms and whatsoever. Even the polls that were being published when it comes to the support for the European Union and for the enlargement have been stopped for the last 2 years. So we don't even have an idea about where the European citizens stand right now. And the negative effects are already in place. We see how the public support for Serbia's integration into the European Union is actually getting smaller and smaller. So now, meanwhile, it's around 50%. And this has, of course, creates once again opportunities for the leadership to exploit. So in a sense, it's, I don't think even these are three chairs. Once again, you have the chair of the Western narrative.
And the
Dragonbear. And then you have like possibilities specifically for small countries to actually exploit.
My final question. We are based in Austria. Traditionally, I think Austria is following Germany in its foreign policies. Probably the exception is the Western Balkans, where Austria has very specific national interests, mostly economic interests. What about China? Where does Austria stand here? Is it following the general EU line, or does it have anything special in relation to China?
So first and foremost, Austria is not being perceived as a geopolitical actor either by partners, so basically neither by partners nor by rivals or competitors. So that's the first. Austria does not have a geopolitical role to play. However, it attaches a huge importance to the Central European countries, the Visegrad countries, Western Balkans, and Eastern Europe. These are the three geographic areas that are so important to Austrian national interests. And when it comes to China, Austria is just too small to have its own unique role in dealing with China, in dealing with Beijing. Basically, the Austrian position reflects the European Union position of the threefold approach to Beijing. If we look back to the last 2 years, during the COVID-19 crisis, there have been no public debates or whatsoever on any Chinese activities or roles, if you like. So 5G, meanwhile, 5G, for instance, which has been a topic of great interest in many European capitals, is no starter here in Austria. And meanwhile, there are two major 5G packages with Chinese participation. So that says a lot how the debate on China is being shaped here in Austria. Bottom up, there is no interest in the topic whatsoever, and top down, the elites, the leadership have been dealing with other issues, navigating through the COVID-19 crisis. Austria has been, as an export-oriented country, has been very hard hit. And basically, there was almost no interest in any kind of global affairs or international relations related topics. The very fact that neither the announcement of the European Union strategy for the Indo-Pacific nor the announcement of AUKUS created any kind of interest or demand for a public debate is also quite telling.
Thank you very much for this conversation and your great insights, Velina.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you.